you do when a peaceful alien civilization comes to you and offers to share their knowledge and technologies with you? You threaten them with nuclear weapons, of course. The weird bit is that it's actually a plot point from this book, but the book is actually not at all about that. I don't want to spend too much time on Aitmatov's biography here, mainly because there's not a lot readily available, and I didn't like the book all that much for me to do extensive research on my own. Chinghiz Aitmatov, a Soviet author of Kyrgyz origin, was born in a village Sheker, Kyrgyz Soviet Republic, on the 12th of December 1928. His father, Tyrikul Aitmatov, was a peasant activist and public figure, and he was arrested and executed in 1937-38. His mother was also a public figure and political worker, so Aitmatov did spend a little bit of time working for the Communist Party, but soon became a veterinarian and spent some time working as such while also writing his short stories. His first stories were published in Russian in 1952, but his true success came in 1958 with a story called Jamila. It was even instantly translated into French by Louis Aragon. Throughout his career as a writer, Aitmatov wrote his stories both in Russian and in Kyrgyz, although as more success and more awards came, he mostly switched to Russian. His notable stories are The White Steamboat, A Day Lasts More Than 100 Years, and A Place for the Skull. Over the years, he's received multitudes of awards from the Soviet Union and is now known as one of the most prominent authors of Kyrgyzstan. Interestingly, all of his works of the post-Soviet period were published in German, translated by Friedrich Hitler. Aitmatov passed away in Germany on the 10th of June 2008 and is now buried near Bishkek. Can I also say that he looks like Kyrgyz Boris Yeltsin, and we will move on. The book that we're talking about today was the first long-ish novel for Aitmatov, and it was first published in 1980. As I read it, I was quite surprised because even for late Soviet Union, it has very long anti-Soviet passages in it. So I was like, how was this even allowed into print? But then again, I read the e-version of the book. It even had an additional chapter dated 2002 where Aitmatov went on about God, which was also not allowed in the USSR, so okay. But then I went to the library to pick up this copy because when I write up the script and I need to look something up, it's just easier to do with a physical copy. And I was looking up a passage that was really anti-Soviet, and it isn't here. This copy is from 1984. It even has the alternate title on here, Buranny Way Station, because Aitmatov couldn't clear a quote from Pasternak, A Day Lasts More Than 100 Years. And so, yeah, it's missing a huge section here in the middle about the victim of political repressions. Obviously, I didn't do a full comparison as to whether or not there are more passages missing from this book, but at least it answered some of my questions as to how it got past censors. Obviously, I will talk you through the entirety of the text, so let's quickly recap the plot now. Location, middle of nowhere way station called Buranly, somewhere in the Kazakhstan steppe. The main character, called Yedigey, learns of the death of a friend and begins to prep the funeral. At the same time, a rocket is being launched from a nearby space center, and we learn that the space station operated jointly by the USA and the USSR encountered alien life, and it's now up to the leaders of the USA and USSR to decide how to deal with a peaceful offer from the aliens to share their knowledge with Earth. Jumping slightly ahead, the decision is to cut all contact with aliens and threaten them with nuclear weapons if they ever decide to come close. Meanwhile, Yedigey convinces Sebidjan, the son of the deceased Kazangab, to bury Kazangab in the old cemetery, so they grab a camel, a tractor, and an excavator and set off towards that old cemetery. On the way there, Yedigey reflects on his life up to that point, how after World War II he had to leave his old life by the Aral Sea and take his wife on the road until he ended up at this way station where Kazangab took him in and even gifted him this very camel that he's riding on today. He then remembers the family of Abu Talib Koptubayev, who also by fate's design ended up at this way station, how this family had a certain zest for life and brought a lot of joy to the station, even though the life and labor was hard and the fate was rather cruel to them. Abu Talib, who was very much concerned about staying in the memory of his sons and thus history itself, began writing down his memories of his captivity during World War II, as well as his partisan work in Yugoslavia, but also he was writing down the local legends, such as the myth of the Mankurt and Anabait, the legend of Chinghiz Khan and the White Cloud, as well as of the old musician who fell in love with the young one. And that unfortunately caught the eye of the passing inspector, and Abu Talib got arrested under the fabricated case of him working for some UK spy organization. Abu Talib, understanding his fate and missing his family quite a bit, and after weeks of torture, takes his own life ahead of the trial. After his wife learns of his death, Yedegey starts to recognize the signs that he is falling in love with the young widow and her sons. Yedegey himself is married with children, and Zeripa, the widow, starts to recognize signs in him that he has feelings for her. And so one day, when Yedegey has to chase his camel down the steppe, she takes the kids and leaves the way station for good. Yedegey is devastated and even takes out his anger on that camel, but learns to live with it and even kicks off the case to exonerate Abu Talib when the winds change in the country, so to speak. That brings us all the way back to them traveling to the old cemetery, but they cannot actually get there because the cemetery is now part of that space center and is walled off. After an unsuccessful attempt at getting in, they bury Kazangab as close to the site as they possibly can, and Yedegey makes his comrades promise that they would bury him here as well when the time comes. The book ends with the rocket being launched from the space center and Yedegey, his camel, and the dog running away from it as if it were some apocalyptic event. Needs to be said that I didn't like the book all that much, and worse, I didn't hate it either. It just simply left me rather empty, which is the worst type of book, not only to read but to review as well. I'm also not used to it with classics. They normally have something for me to grasp onto. They're classics for a reason. They either have a theme or a moral or an emotion that can be a jumping off point for me to start talking about the book. And it does have a theme, yes, although we will talk about why it didn't work for me a little bit later on. What I'm much more worried about is emotion. When I finish a book, I normally browse through the readers' reviews just to get a feel of what other people thought. And when I actually didn't like a book, it's some sort of like validation that I'm not the only bitter hater out there. With this one, it felt like I was. All of the reviews are all about how moving they found the book, how it sparked something in them, how it made them cry. Look, it doesn't take much to make me cry. A gust of wind might do it. But I didn't cry with this book. Not once. Not even close. The closest that I came was kind of sighing like, "Oh, that's sad." And I find it weird because I normally can emote and relate just fine even if the theme doesn't resonate with me. So there's something wrong here. And I'm not even sure that Aitmatov was going for emotionality here. The way that he writes, it feels rather distant. Just to make sure, I read his most famous short story, Jamilad, because that one for sure is going for emotions. And yes, I did feel it a little bit more there, but there's still something missing. And I don't want to gender stereotype here, but it feels like a manly man who's trying to write out his emotions, but he's had like 2 in his life and he doesn't know how to write about them, but he's seen other people do it, so he tries to mimic them. So the words needed are there, but they just simply don't hit. Human emotions are not his strong suit, is what I'm saying, and we will talk animal emotions in a bit, because that one is a doozy. But Aitmatov's strength lies in the way that he writes nature, and that's where the emotionality comes through. There is a certain beauty in the way that he writes about the steppes of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, how he depicts this rather barren land, the legends that he chooses to write about. And I know that for people that come from these parts, it can be rather impactful. I've never been to those places, so it's a little bit more academic for me, I guess, but I can see the love that he carries for it, so at least there's that. And maybe it's enough for the themes that he's chosen. But before we get into themes, let's talk structure because it's going to be important. Aitmatov mixes different, well, not genres necessarily, he mixes the archaic with the futuristic, because there are three main streams here. The current day storyline of the 1950s Soviet Union, the myths and legends of old, with the Chinghiz Khan storyline and the McCourt myth, and the futuristic side plot about the cosmonauts encountering the alien life form. In any good novel, these added storylines need to comment on the main theme and the main storyline, providing juxtaposition or a parallel depending on how you want to work on it. And I think the old legends and myths that he brings in do that, maybe a little bit too bluntly sometimes, but they work. The futuristic storyline hangs like a half-severed limb because it is somewhat needed for the main storyline, although it could have been replaced with anything else but this Baikonur stand-in next to the way station. What is worst is that it's not thematically relevant. It creates its own separate theme. I've seen an interpretation that brings it a little bit closer to the main storyline. However, it takes a few leaps of logic to get there, so at best it makes it a poorly integrated storyline. It's not even written as legends are as their own separate chapter. No, it's brought up in the beginning, resolved and abandoned within the first quarter of the book. However, it is sprinkled throughout the text, so it's not even structurally a good choice. It should have been edited differently, if not removed entirely. My best guess is that the book was written at the tail end of that space craze, so maybe that's reason enough for it to be here. I, however, do not believe that, especially if you wanted to have that clash of the archaic and the futuristic. He should have explored it more, and he never did. One more point about structure. The main storyline is cyclical. The inciting incident in the form of the death of a friend allows Hidege to reflect on his past life. While on the side here, the cosmonaut storyline also kicks off and goes on for a little bit while we're already in a flashback sequence with Hidege, so it just creates more confusion as to what's going on when. And the legends that Aitmatov chooses, they are brought on sometimes organically, sometimes less so, until Hidege's memories bring us all the way back to the start, to the funeral of the friend. And I only have one gripe here, and that's the inconsistency, since the legends are brought on sometimes more smoothly than other times. Like, for example, one of the characters is writing them down, so they become not only thematically relevant, but also plot relevant. While other times, the legend just might start out of nowhere with the start of the new chapter, and then retroactively explained as the character reflects on the legend. All of this is rather sloppy structuring, and you feel that when you're reading the book. All of these constant time jumps and sidebars, they never flow smoothly one into the other. I also understand that Aitmatov has only written short prose before. This is his first long novel, so maybe it should excuse it some. But no, a lot of this book feels disjointed, and it actually detracts from the enjoyment of the novel. Now, finally, let's talk themes. First, let's mention Hidege, as he is the main character, and his journey. In some sense, he is the continuation of this wonderful tradition in Russian literature of a small man, this ordinary person who gets crushed by circumstances in his life way beyond his control. I've also seen Hidege compared to Prince Myshkin, this pure soul that is once again thrown into the world not worthy of him. Hidege also carries many characteristics of the good communist man, a manly man doing manual labor without complaint for the good of his community and country with a strong moral compass. And I think all of that is true to an extent. However, Hidege as a character is rather amorphous and a little bit too fictional. He's simply a good man, and that's about it. And not to diss that, but in many ways he's not a character but a purpose. He is there to show us that there are still good people out there who would say that it's wrong to prosecute Abu Talib under false pretenses, who will seek justice for him when it becomes possible, the one who would try to uphold tradition and bury Kazangab in this old cemetery. He is that elder who should be this moral guide for the younger generation. He is simply good. The only time where he displays a character flaw and about his only character plot is when he falls in love with the widow of the recently repressed Abu Talib. And even then, Hidege has a wife and daughters when he falls in love and lust with this beautiful young widow and her sons, and he agonizes over this choice that he has to make, how not to embarrass the woman and not bring shame on his own wife. And it's all rather pure and innocent, this desire of his to be a father and a husband for this woman and her sons who've just recently lost their beloved husband and father. He just simply wants to be like their protector, to provide for them in their hour of need. But then the metaphor comes in. And let me tell you, camels in heat were not on my bingo card for this year's reading, but here we are. Right then, Yiddige's prized camel, a stallion, are they called stallions if they're camels? He goes into rut and starts going after the females in his close vicinity, but also terrorizing the neighboring stations, kind of destroying his competition and getting all of the females. So Yiddige needs to chase him down and quite literally beat him into submission to bring him back. And while Yiddige is gone, Ziripa takes the kids and leaves the station to save him from temptation, I would imagine. What follows actually is a terrifying scene of Yiddige taking out his anger on his camel and beating him half to death. So yeah, trigger warning for animal cruelty, I guess. To soothe us afterwards, a legend follows about this old musician who falls in love with a young female musician, but the tribe elders forbid it and actually tie him up to keep him away from her. So I understand what Aitmatov is trying to do here. What confuses me is why? What's the point here? What's all this for? What theme are we exploring here? As I said, Yiddige as a character doesn't have much dimension, so what does this add? That he actually never had a chance to resist temptation, and so he remained the same? What does this add to the story as a whole? Because the story is not actually about Yiddige, it's about memory. Memory and staying connected to the past, to be more specific. It is most obvious in the Mankurt legend that Aitmatov actually made up. It's not an actual Kyrgyz legend. It tells a story of this zombie-like creature that is brought on through unfathomable torture, and all of that is achieved through removing his memories, and that makes him into a perfect slave, so much so that he can even kill his own mother and not bat an eye. The story is brought on to provide this metaphor, how losing this connection to the past can actually be detrimental. And there is some debate as to who in the story stands in for the Mankurt. Some say it's Sebijan, the son of Kazangab, because he is trying to distance himself as much as he possibly can from the traditions of the past. On a broader scale, it's more likely people like investigator Tensingbaev or the lieutenant of the same name, people who've integrated themselves into the Soviet system to the point that they've lost all their humanity, that they're willing to prosecute an innocent man under false pretenses for personal gain, or on a smaller scale, simply not let people bury their dead in an old cemetery. If we extend that metaphor, we can sort of tie it into the cosmic storyline, where the theme is actually that isolationism can never lead to progress. There, Earth stands in for the Soviet experiment, a populace guarding itself with nuclear weapons against any new pacifist or progressive ideas that come from the outside and treat them as a threat. How wonderful is it that Russia still continues on that same trajectory? But with a few leaps of logic, as it is not supported within the text, we can assume that the Soviet Union in Aitmatov's story is run by these metaphorical mankurts, so the Earth is as well. And so the decision to drive the aliens away is made by these people, these mindless people who've lost their connection to the past and thus their humanity. I'd say that there is nothing particularly wrong with this theme of memories and staying connected to one's roots. However, for me personally, this idea is often tied to rather archaic, barbaric behaviors and beliefs, and excusing terrible behaviors by traditions. Oh, the woman needs to stay in the kitchen, that's how it always been. Oh, being gay is terrible, our forefathers never would have allowed for it. So this staying connected to the past well has been poisoned for me. I understand that Aitmatov is more likely talking about cultural heritage, like not losing their Kyrgyz identity in the face of the Soviet assimilation. That's quite literally what happens in the story. The Space Center launch site took over the old cemetery, so they cannot bury people there. And they even are planning on building new apartment buildings on that cemetery. So I get it. I simply cannot feel it. As we know, white people have no culture, and the one that we have is mostly colonial, so maybe not something to cling to. So I can appreciate why Kyrgyz people, or even Kazakhs, because the characters in the story are Kazakhs, can find this theme a little bit more moving than I ever could. And I can say that the theme is explored quite well within the story, both in metaphors that he chooses and the legends that he brings up, except for one instance that I found really confusing. Kazangap, the dead guy from the beginning, he had a father who was prosecuted for being a kulak, this wealthy peasant who were essentially executed or exiled in the early years of the Soviet Union. And I think in the case of the character, he was even falsely accused and maybe exonerated. But Kazangap, the character, carries that event with a great deal of guilt and shame and even anger. And so at one point later on, when they're being drafted into World War II, I think, he mistakenly thinks that he's been denied that because of this particular blemish in his past. And so he comes in rather hot and angry into this guy's office who's making the decision, kind of crying like, my father was a good man, how dare you deny me this opportunity on these grounds and all of that. And the man in charge is like, what are you on about? Who even cares about such things anymore? You were denied for different reasons, like go in peace. And to me, it clashes slightly with the theme, doesn't it? Kazangap clings to this piece of the past that nobody cares about anymore, and yet it defines him to such an extent. I found that interesting. But it is obviously here for different reasons, and that's the second theme of the book, and that is of political repressions, specifically Stalin's repressions. Aitmatov's father was prosecuted and executed in 1938, so it is personal for him. So that's why the entirety of the Abutalib's arc is here, as well as the Chinghiz Khan and the White Cloud legend that Aitmatov tells us. Do you say Chinghiz Khan or Kyrgyz Khan? I will say Chinghiz Khan. The story is that Chinghiz Khan was once told that if God favored him, he would always have a small white cloud follow him. And he starts noticing it, so he decides, like, yeah, I have the favor of the gods, so he decides to march in Europe. While traveling there, he tells his party not to have sex, for some reason, and one of the warriors disobeys and has a child with a seamstress. Chinghiz Khan finds out and orders both of them hanged, and that's when the white cloud leaves him and actually follows the child who's been saved by the maid. Chinghiz Khan notices that he's lost the favor of the gods and decides not to march on Europe anymore. Chinghiz Khan stands in for Stalin here, if you didn't get that. Shame that Stalin didn't have a white cloud like that, although he probably wouldn't have cared. But going back to the theme of repressions, it's probably unfair for me to judge this book on this theme now. We've since had books that delve deeper into this theme, but also for 1980, it is stated rather bluntly how ruthless the machine was, and also how inhumane and self-serving it was. Abutalib is first eyed for being a prisoner during World War II, since Stalin's order was that any prisoner of war was deemed a traitor or deserter, since the soldiers were expected to die but not become prisoners. Abutalib then becomes part of the partisan unit in Yugoslavia and is cleared on both accounts upon his return to the Soviet Union, and still needs to escape to this way station in the middle of nowhere to escape the court of public opinion. There he's noticed by some inspector, and the case is fabricated that he's in contact with some UK spy organization or something, especially since the Soviet Union at the time fell out with Yugoslavia, so the case simply presented itself. And we are shown this through the thoughts of the inspector, who already imagines the promotion that he'll get once the case gets through. There are a couple of things to mention here. There is a heart-wrenching scene when Abutalib is being transported to Almaty, and he passes by on the train by the way station, and he simply wishes to get a glimpse of his family one last time, and he does, and he cries afterwards. It's really, really powerful. The bitter irony here is that once they get to Almaty, the inspector gets drunk on the train, and so Abutalib is being transported by some other guys and gets a chance to pull an Anna Karenina and throws himself under the train. The irony is that a few weeks later, when his wife gets the notice that he's died of a heart attack, that same day the news breaks of Stalin's death. So had he waited, maybe he would have served a little bit of time, but maybe he would have reconnected with his family. Unfortunately, history doesn't deal in what-ifs. But another thing that is shown here is the prickly nature of these repressions and how easily the winds can change. Stalin's death changed a lot, and the repressions were never as severe as they were with him. But also, like in this particular case, foreign politics change. Yugoslavia became friendly again, so Yedege even manages to get the case started to exonerate Abu Talib and prosecute those who've built a case against him. It is slightly fantastical how easy it is for him to do that, but not that far from reality. People within the system who go after those oppressed need to remember that the system can turn on them at any given moment, and there won't be an escape then. This theme is important, and especially for it to be brought up in the 1980s, even though this entire passage about Abu Talib's train ride and the thoughts of the inspector is missing from this edition. There is one thing that I found slightly confusing and I didn't like, and that's seemingly the conclusion that Aitmatov comes to. Why had he done this? What drove him to such an evil act? I have thought a lot about this, remembering what I know about similar cases and what you told me, Yedege. Having considered all this, I tried to understand what prompted him, but still it was hard to explain. What could have inspired such hatred in him towards a person whom he did not know? Perhaps this was a certain disease, an epidemic which infected people in that period of our history. Perhaps there was a perennious, envious-stricken people that gradually made them heartless and led them to these acts of cruelty. But what sort of jealousy could the person of Abu Talib Kutebaev arouse? This remains a mystery to me. As for the method used, it was as old as the world itself. Once you had only to denounce someone as a heretic, and he would have been stoned to death in the bazaars of Bukhara, or in Europe burned at stake. After the facts had been revealed in the review of Abu Talib's case, I was once more convinced that it would take a long time for people to get rid themselves of this disease, this hatred of a person's personality. It somehow comes off as this human condition, this cruelty, instead of it being a product of circumstances, of environment, of conditioning, ideology, and all of that. And I do not claim to have a better answer here, but I would have appreciated a little bit more exploration from the author here. Otherwise, it just simply comes off as factual, like it's not something that we can change, and I do not think that it's where we need to leave such a topic. Worse is, if we extend this approach to the novel as a whole, a day lasts more than 100 years, then nothing changes. From Chinghiz Khan to Stalin, nothing changes, nothing to be done, same cruelty, same pain. Even if a benevolent alien civilization comes to you and wants to share their peaceful ways with you, you threaten them with nuclear weapons. Nothing to be changed, nothing to break this freaking cycle. And then you dare to suggest to appeal to traditions? And here I was wondering why I didn't like the book all that much. Overall, if you ask my opinion, I feel like the status of Aitmatov as a great Kyrgyz author is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. If the competition is not there, it's not easier to be great. No, it's not fair. It's not fair. I have not read other things from him. I've heard that Place for the Skull, what a terrible translation of that title, or even White Steamboat are quite powerful, I cannot say. However, if you want to read something from Aitmatov, or Kyrgyz literature for that matter, I would suggest that you read Jamila. It gives you a flavor for his writing, and it's much more compact, and it is beautifully written. That's actually something that I cannot take away from him. He writes beautifully, truly beautiful Russian prose. And maybe only try A Day Lasts More Than 100 Years if any of the themes I've just talked to you about resonate with you at all.